The night was heavy with the thrill of revving engines and the smell of gasoline as Emily Carter, a daring 19-year-old, stood amidst the crowd with her friends, trying to soak in the raw energy of the Desert Biker Rally. The event, held in a remote stretch of Arizona desert, was legendary among those seeking a rough and unfiltered escape. Emily had heard about these rallies, wild gatherings where thrill-seekers and outlaws blurred lines, and tonight she wanted to see it all for herself. As the night wore on, Emily felt a strange pull in the crowd, like the center of gravity had shifted. She soon spotted the reason. Max Ryder, a notorious figure with a reputation that sent shivers down spines across the state. He was tall, rugged, with tattoos creeping up his neck and a gaze as cold as the desert nights. His gang, the Reapers, had a reputation that was whispered about in shadows: violence, extortion, and an ironclad code of loyalty that made them untouchable. But what caught Max's attention now wasn't a rival or a business deal. It was Emily. She could feel his eyes on her, predatory, assessing, as though he was deciding something about her. Ignoring her friend's growing unease, Emily met Max's gaze with a defiant stare of her own. It was a silent challenge, a spark in the air that couldn't be ignored. Max, a man who rarely let anything stand in his way, felt the pulse of her defiance and decided he would extinguish it. He made his way through the crowd, flanked by two of his men, his eyes locked onto Emily. "Bold, aren't we?" Max's voice was a low growl, dripping with mockery as he stopped directly in front of her. He towered over Emily, his presence menacing, but she held her ground, refusing to shrink under his gaze. "Just here to enjoy the night like everyone else," Emily replied, her voice steady though her pulse hammered in her throat. Max smirked, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Looks to me like you're a little too confident for your own good," he sneered, moving closer until they were inches apart. "Maybe someone should teach you a lesson in humility." Before Emily could react, Max's fist swung toward her face in a brutal arc, connecting with her nose. The crack echoed louder in her head than any engine roar. She felt the sharp pain of broken bone, followed by the wet trickle of blood running down her face. The shock of it froze her in place, disbelieving that someone would cross such a line so easily. Her friends screamed, some of them scrambling back, but Max's gang had already formed a perimeter, sneering at anyone who dared move forward. Emily fell to the ground, gasping as her vision blurred. She tried to push herself up, but Max's boot came down hard, pinning her shoulder against the gritty sand. "Looks like you're not so tough now, are you?" Max mocked as he yanked a knife from his belt. He knelt beside her, grabbing a fistful of her hair, and with a twisted smile, began to cut through the strands, each snip falling like a death knell. Her hair, her dignity, and her pride fell in shreds on the sand as her friends looked on, horrified and powerless. Emily felt humiliation clawing up her throat. The pain in her face was nothing compared to the violation of watching her hair drop to the ground, knowing she was powerless to stop it. Her friends, paralyzed with fear, watched helplessly, knowing that if they moved a muscle, Max's men would make sure they regretted it. Once satisfied with his work, Max rose, letting her hair slip through his fingers and scatter in the wind. He spat on the ground next to her, a final mark of his disdain. With a cold laugh, he motioned to his gang to leave. Emily lay on the ground, the broken pieces of herself scattered around her like the hair he had cut. She felt her friends finally rush to her side, their trembling hands lifting her, their tearful voices blurring together as they tried to comfort her. They managed to get her to a hospital, where the doctors treated her injuries, but nothing could heal the anger and shame that simmered beneath the surface. She would carry the scars from that night, both visible and invisible, for a long time. When the news reached her father, Jack Carter, it hit him like a physical blow. Jack had retired from a life filled with danger as a CIA agent, leaving it all behind for a peaceful existence. But seeing his daughter broken, humiliated, and scarred brought every dark instinct flooding back. As he looked at the photos of Emily's bruised face and the blood matted in what remained of her hair, something inside him broke, an unstoppable force unleashed by fury and love. Jack knew what he had to do. He would hunt down the man who had hurt his daughter, and he would make sure that Max Ryder and his gang understood the true meaning of retribution. The Arizona desert felt different this time. Jack Carter moved under the cover of darkness, his presence hidden behind the disguise of a lone biker. His years in the CIA had taught him more than he ever wanted to know about disappearing in plain sight, and he had donned the worn leather jacket, torn jeans, and dust-stained helmet with the ease of someone slipping into an old habit. His only focus now was finding Max Ryder and his gang, making sure every one of them paid for what they had done to his daughter, Emily. The first place to start was here, among the roadside bars and dusty motels where men like Max and his crew thrived. Jack slipped into his role, a gruff biker with no past and no connections, looking for nothing but adventure and a place to belong. Within days, he was frequenting the same places the gang did, learning the rhythms of their world. He watched, he listened, and every word, every glance that passed between the gang members was silently filed away, fueling his plan. Jack was patient. He knew better than to rush. A single wrong move could end this before it began. Each night, he would head to a new bar, blending in, silently observing the men who seemed to be connected to Max's gang. It wasn't long before he overheard the name Reapers, spoken with a mix of awe and fear, and he realized he was close. Every now and then, he would buy a drink for some low-ranking member, striking up conversations that seemed innocent but allowed him to extract information piece by piece. He discovered that Max's gang was involved in more than just intimidation and street fights. They were entrenched in a network of human trafficking and smuggling, darker than anything Jack had anticipated. Each new detail sharpened his resolve. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. These men were predators, feeding on the vulnerable. Jack's mission became clear. He wasn't just going to take down Max, he was going to dismantle the Reapers. One evening, Jack spotted an opportunity. A young man with a nervous demeanor sat alone at the bar, wearing the Reaper's leather patch. He didn't have the hardened look of most gang members, and his eyes darted around as though he didn't fully belong. Jack approached, introducing himself with a casual nod, ordering a drink, and soon struck up a conversation. The young man introduced himself as Jordan, a low-level member who had joined the gang out of desperation. As the night wore on and the drinks kept coming, Jordan revealed more than he probably intended. Jack learned that Jordan despised the violence and had long considered leaving, but knew that walking away from the Reapers was a death sentence. Sensing a potential ally, Jack seized the moment. Lowering his voice, he leaned in and muttered, "There are people who want to see Max fall. I can help you if you help me." Jordan hesitated, clearly afraid, but desperation and a glimmer of hope flickered in his eyes. He agreed, on one condition. If he helped Jack, he would be protected from any retaliation from the gang. Jack nodded solemnly, knowing he could keep that promise. With Jordan on his side, he had a man inside the Reapers' ranks, someone who knew the gang's movements and weaknesses. Over the next several days, Jack and Jordan communicated in coded messages, exchanging information in the shadows. Through Jordan, Jack learned the gang's routine and discovered that Max had been planning a major gathering, where every member of the Reapers would come together for a race that doubled as a rally for their criminal operations. It was the perfect opportunity. With everyone in one place, Jack could begin to break them down from the inside. But Max was no fool. The tensions Jack had carefully stirred among the gang members hadn't gone unnoticed, and rumors of a traitor spread like wildfire. Max, growing increasingly paranoid, began questioning his men, watching them more closely. Jack knew he was running out of time. If Max discovered Jordan's disloyalty, they would both be finished. Jack decided it was time to act. He set traps that pitted the gang members against one another, feeding false information through Jordan, who would let it slip to just the right ears. Soon, fingers were pointing, and loyalties were breaking down. Small fights erupted within the ranks, gang members accusing one another of betrayal. In the chaos, Jack's plan unfolded seamlessly, and Jordan continued to feed him valuable details on the gang's operations, including Max's next hideout. One night, Jordan met Jack at a desolate rest stop outside of town, his face pale and eyes wide. "Max is getting suspicious," he whispered urgently, casting nervous glances around. "If he finds out I'm working with you, I'm dead." Jack placed a steady hand on Jordan's shoulder. "You've done well. Just one more thing. Tell me where they're headed next." Jordan took a deep breath, nodding. "There's a race coming up. It's where Max and the top men will meet. If you're going to do this, that's where you need to be." With Jordan's information, Jack began laying his final plans. He prepared himself mentally and physically, his old training kicking in as he sharpened his focus on the task at hand. He would be ready for that race, ready to face Max and put an end to the Reapers. But as he readied himself for what lay ahead, he couldn't shake the image of Emily's bruised face, a reminder of why he was willing to risk everything. For Jack, this wasn't just another mission. It was a reckoning, a chance to make things right for his daughter and to prevent anyone else from suffering at the hands of Max Ryder and his gang. And as the night of the race drew closer, Jack knew that he was on the path of no return, stepping deeper into a world he had long left behind. The stakes were higher than ever, but he would not back down. As the sun set on the night of the big race, Jack Carter felt a calmness that had eluded him for years. The venue was perfect for his purpose, a desolate stretch of dirt road in the middle of the desert, surrounded by rows of towering cliffs that blocked any escape. The Reapers had gathered, a swarm of bikers roaring in excitement, and Max stood among them, confident, oblivious to the trap that was tightening around him. Jack moved silently, blending in with the crowd of onlookers, his biker disguise fitting him like a second skin. He wore a patched jacket with a skull emblem that matched the insignias of some other gangs in the area, ensuring he was just another shadow. But his mind was a razor, sharp with memories of Emily's suffering, the rage that had kept him awake night after night. Jack had scouted the area days before, planting weapons in hidden spots, pipes, chains, anything he could use in close combat. He knew that if it came down to it, every second would matter, and he needed to be prepared. As he walked among the Reapers, he mentally marked each face, remembering every detail, so no one would escape unpunished. Tonight, he intended to sever the gang's power at its core. He noticed the increased tension within the gang. Weeks of sabotage had fractured their unity, and every wary glance was a reminder of the traitor they suspected in their midst. Jordan had done his part well, sowing the seeds of discord, but he had been silent for the past day, which worried Jack. There was no way to know if he had been caught, or if he had simply vanished to protect himself. Just as Jack moved closer to the front, he spotted Max. The gang leader was watching the crowd with a cautious eye, a glint of suspicion behind his otherwise arrogant gaze. Jack saw Max scan the faces around him, a flicker of worry crossing his expression as he muttered instructions to his right-hand man, Butch, a towering brute with tattoos snaking down his arms and a perpetual sneer. It was then that Jack felt a presence beside him. Jordan appeared, his face shadowed by a cap, eyes darting nervously. He leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. "They're on to me. I don't have much time." Jack's jaw tightened. "You did well, Jordan. One last thing. Tell me where Max keeps his main stash of weapons. If we cut that off, the Reapers will be defenseless." Jordan glanced nervously over his shoulder. "They have a lockup near the cliffs. A small cave with a metal door. It's guarded, but if you take it out, you'll cripple them." Jack nodded, squeezing Jordan's shoulder in a rare show of gratitude. "Get out of here, kid. You've done enough." But before Jordan could move, a shout echoed across the crowd. "Traitor!" Butch had spotted Jordan and was already charging toward them, fists clenched. Jack stepped in front of Jordan instinctively, his hands up, ready for a fight. The crowd quieted, a circle forming as Butch lunged, his massive frame bulldozing toward Jack. Jack sidestepped the first blow, his reflexes honed from years of training, but Butch was relentless. A heavy fist connected with Jack's side, the impact driving him back, but he recovered quickly, landing a sharp jab to Butch's ribs. The fight escalated, the crowd cheering as fists flew. Jack was a whirlwind of calculated blows, his movements efficient and deadly. Butch, frustrated and humiliated by Jack's skill, swung wildly, leaving an opening that Jack seized. He grabbed a length of chain he had stashed nearby and wrapped it around Butch's throat, tightening until the brute staggered, gasping for air. Finally, Butch collapsed, defeated, leaving Jack standing victorious as the crowd erupted in awe. But the silence that followed was colder than the desert night. Max stepped forward, his eyes narrowed with recognition, as though piecing together who this stranger truly was. "You're no biker," he sneered. "Who are you?" Jack pulled off his helmet, locking eyes with Max. "I'm the father of the girl you brutalized." The words hit Max like a sledgehammer, and for a brief moment, the usually unshakable gang leader faltered. Then, with a twisted grin, he barked orders to his men. "Get him!" Chaos exploded around them. The Reapers charged, but Jack was ready. He swung the chain, using it as a whip to keep the gang members at bay, his movements sharp and brutal. The small weapons he'd hidden throughout the area became his lifelines. A pipe here, a broken bottle there, each turned into a tool of survival as he fought his way through the fray. Jack's mind was a storm of calculated violence. For every face he saw, he remembered Emily's bruised and battered expression. Each punch he landed was a promise to her, a message that he would never allow them to harm her again. The gang members, once cocky and arrogant, began to waver, realizing they were facing a force more relentless than anything they'd ever encountered. In the middle of the skirmish, Jack caught sight of Jordan, scrambling to defend himself against two gang members who had cornered him. With a swift movement, Jack fought his way to the boy, taking down his attackers with lethal efficiency. "Run, Jordan," he commanded, and the young man, bleeding but alive, nodded and bolted into the night. As the fight raged on, Max saw his men falling back, some fleeing into the desert, their morale shattered. He snarled, pulling out a knife and advancing on Jack, his eyes blazing with hatred. The two men faced off, a silent promise of retribution hanging between them. "Your daughter had it coming," Max taunted, his voice dripping with malice. Jack's anger surged, and without hesitation, he lunged. The two clashed in a brutal melee, each man landing punishing blows, their hatred for each other evident in every strike. Max fought dirty, slashing with his knife, but Jack anticipated every move, his years of training giving him the upper hand. Finally, Jack seized Max's knife hand, twisting it until the weapon clattered to the ground. With one final, devastating punch, he sent Max sprawling into the dust. Jack stood over him, breathing heavily, the weight of his victory settling over him. Max lay there, his face twisted in rage and fear. But instead of ending his life, Jack leaned in, his voice low. "The law will have you. You'll rot in a cage, and every scar you left on my daughter will haunt you." As sirens echoed in the distance, Jack knew it was over. He had broken the Reapers, leaving Max and the remains of his gang for the authorities. His mission was complete, but as he walked away, his heart was heavy. There was still a long road to healing, for Emily, for himself, but at last he had begun the journey. Under the pale desert moonlight, Jack Carter moved through the shadows like a predator, his resolve sharpened after the bloody clash at the biker rally. He had left Max Ryder battered and humiliated, but the leader of the Reapers wasn't broken yet. The gang still had enough loyal members left to regroup, and Jack knew they'd want revenge. He needed to act swiftly, closing the net before Max could slip through his fingers again. With the help of his old CIA contacts, Jack put the final phase of his plan into motion, orchestrating an all-out ambush. His preparations were meticulous. Jack had reached out to a small network of trusted former colleagues willing to operate off the record. They set up surveillance on every Reaper hideout and tracked Max's movements. But Jack had underestimated Max's ability to adapt. The gang leader had managed to turn the tables, bribing someone in Jack's network to feed him information about the ambush. Max now knew who Jack was and understood his lethal skill set, realizing that Emily was Jack's only weakness. Max made his move, launching a devastating counterstrike. With chilling precision, He had Emily abducted from her apartment, leaving nothing but a cryptic message scrawled on her living room wall. "If you want her back, you know where to find me." Jack found himself torn between his fury and the cold fear that he might lose his daughter if he wasn't careful. Desperation surged through him, pushing aside the methodical calm he had carefully maintained. Max's message had included a set of coordinates leading to a remote warehouse just outside a ghost town, a place the Reapers used for storage and secret meetings. He knew it was a trap, but there was no other option. Emily's life hung in the balance. Jack arrived at the warehouse under the cover of night, using every skill he'd honed in his career to stay hidden as he approached. The building was surrounded by gang members, their motorcycles lined up like a blockade. But Jack had anticipated this, taking down guards one by one, his movements as silent as shadows, until he finally slipped into the building unnoticed. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of steel beams and stacked crates, the air thick with the smell of oil and gasoline. Jack's heart pounded as he scanned the dark corners, his mind racing with possible routes to Emily. He finally spotted her, bound and gagged, seated in a metal chair in the center of the room, under a lone, flickering light. Her face was bruised, her eyes wide with terror as she struggled against her bindings. Jack's first instinct was to run to her, but he knew better. Max wouldn't leave her unguarded. He crept along the perimeter, his eyes adjusting to the dim light until he saw them. Max and a handful of his remaining gang members, hidden in the shadows, waiting with a cruel patience. Max had a twisted smile on his face, his knife glinting under the light as he watched Jack. "Didn't think you'd actually show up alone, Carter," Max taunted, stepping forward. "Guess blood really is thicker than sense." Jack didn't respond. He simply advanced, his eyes fixed on Emily, who nodded at him, a silent show of courage that strengthened his resolve. Without breaking stride, Jack reached into his jacket, pulling out a flashbang he had prepared for just this moment. He threw it toward Max and his men, diving to cover his eyes and ears as the device exploded with a deafening blast of light and sound. The men staggered back, disoriented, giving Jack the window he needed. He rushed to Emily, slashing her bindings with a quick swipe of his knife and helping her to her feet. Emily clung to him, her body shaking, but Jack gave her a reassuring squeeze and pointed to a hidden exit he had scoped out. "Run, Em. I'll be right behind you." Emily nodded, stumbling toward the door as Jack turned to face Max, who had recovered from the flashbang, his fury burning hotter than ever. Max launched at Jack with his knife, slashing and stabbing in a flurry of attacks that were as wild as they were brutal. Jack sidestepped each swing, his movements deliberate and controlled, waiting for the perfect moment. Their fight escalated, violent and raw, each man's hatred pushing him beyond pain and exhaustion. They grappled, fists and elbows landing with sickening force, the sounds of bones cracking and grunts of pain echoing through the warehouse. Jack took a brutal punch to the ribs, his vision blurring from the impact, but he retaliated with a sharp jab to Max's throat, momentarily choking him. Max staggered back, gasping for air, his knife slipping from his hand. Jack seized the opportunity, grabbing Max by the collar and slamming him against a steel beam, his voice a low growl. "You hurt my daughter. You've terrorized her and too many others. It ends now." Max glared at him, a twisted smirk forming on his swollen lips. "You think killing me changes anything? The Reapers will live on. There's always someone willing to take the throne." Jack leaned in close, his expression cold and unrelenting. "Then I'll make sure they know who's watching them from the shadows." With one last punch, Jack left Max crumpled on the floor, gasping, his rein finally broken. But Jack knew that Max deserved justice, not a martyr's death. He secured Max to one of the steel beams, using the gang leader's own chains to bind him, leaving him there for the authorities to find. With Emily safely waiting outside, Jack activated the silent distress signal he had set up with his former CIA contacts, ensuring a SWAT team would arrive within minutes. He walked out of the warehouse into the cool desert night, where Emily stood, her face a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's over," he said, pulling her into a tight hug, his voice breaking slightly as the adrenaline wore off. Emily buried her face in his shoulder, the weight of her fear finally releasing in silent tears. Together, they turned to watch as police lights pierced the dark, their sirens growing louder. Jack knew he had crossed lines, had revisited a dark side of himself he'd hoped was buried. But as he looked at Emily, he felt a glimmer of peace, knowing he had fought for her, that he had protected her as a father should. The noose had finally tightened around Max Ryder and his gang, and as Jack held Emily close, he felt, for the first time, that they could leave the darkness of the past behind. The days after the showdown were filled with a haunting quiet that seemed to linger in every corner of Jack Carter's home. Emily was safe, and Max Ryder was behind bars, facing an array of charges that ensured he would never harm another soul again. Yet, as Jack watched Emily move through the house with a vacant expression, he knew their ordeal was far from over. Both of them bore invisible scars, and Jack couldn't shake the weight of guilt pressing down on him. The bruises on Emily's face had faded, but the trauma etched into her eyes remained, a painful reminder of his inability to protect her when she needed him most. At the hospital, the doctors had assured them that Emily's physical injuries would heal with time, but Jack knew the deeper wounds were the ones that needed attention. He hovered nearby, struggling to bridge the silence between them. Despite his years of training and combat, Jack found himself utterly unequipped to help his daughter heal from the torment she had endured. He sat beside her, trying to find the words, but they felt hollow, inadequate. Instead, he listened as Emily shared fragments of her feelings, of the fear, the helplessness, and the vulnerability she'd felt in Max's grasp. One evening, Emily turned to him, her voice breaking. "You know, I was always afraid of the stories I heard about you, Dad, about your past with the CIA, the dangerous life you left behind. But now, I don't know if I'm relieved or terrified that you brought that part of you back for me." Jack felt a pang of regret twist in his chest. He met her gaze, his own eyes heavy with the years he had spent hiding that part of himself. "Emily, I wanted to keep you away from that life for a reason. I didn't want you to ever see that side of me. But when I saw what Max did to you," his voice faltered, raw emotion breaking through his usual stoic demeanor, "I knew I'd do whatever it took to keep you safe, even if it meant becoming the person I tried so hard to leave behind." The confession seemed to unlock something between them, a shared understanding that bridged the gap wrought by years of secrets. Emily nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I don't blame you, Dad. I don't want that darkness to be the only thing that defines us now. I want to be able to trust, to feel safe again." Her words struck deep. Jack had been so focused on vengeance, on hunting Max down, that he hadn't considered what life beyond revenge would look like. In the days that followed, Jack made a conscious effort to be there for Emily in ways he had never been before. They spent hours talking, sharing memories of simpler times, of childhood moments Jack had cherished but had hidden away, too afraid to confront the father he should have been. Jack began to see Emily's strength shine through as she talked openly about her pain and fears. He realized that she was as much his protector now as he had once been hers. Emily suggested they take small steps to rebuild their lives, starting with a return to routine and familiar comforts. As they healed together, Jack's resolve to protect Emily shifted from a fierce warrior's vow to a gentle commitment. He joined her in therapy sessions, where they both unearthed painful truths and acknowledged the trust they had to rebuild. Jack had learned to be a soldier, a strategist, a protector in the shadows, but Emily was teaching him how to be a father in the light, how to allow vulnerability to foster closeness instead of weakness. One evening, as they prepared dinner side by side, Emily glanced at him with a faint smile. "Remember when you used to make pancakes shaped like animals on Sunday mornings?" she asked, her voice tinged with a hint of nostalgia. Jack chuckled, a warmth spreading through him. "You always liked the cat-shaped ones. I remember I had to get creative with the batter to make the whiskers just right." For the first time in what felt like years, they laughed, the sound filling the house with a sense of hope that had been absent for too long. They found themselves recreating old memories, embracing a rhythm that was unfamiliar but comforting. Jack began to understand that, beyond the violence and vengeance, the real strength lay in the quiet moments of healing they shared. After weeks of recovery, Emily suggested a visit to the coast, where she could finally face the open space and fresh air without fear. Jack agreed, sensing her need for freedom and renewal. They drove together, the desert landscape gradually transforming into rolling hills, and finally, the open ocean. Emily stood at the shore, letting the waves lap at her feet, her face peaceful. For Jack, the sight of his daughter reclaiming her joy felt like a victory more profound than any he'd known. As they returned home, Jack knew their journey was far from over, but he no longer feared the darkness that had once overshadowed their lives. He understood now that protecting Emily meant more than shielding her from danger. It meant giving her the space to find her own strength. Jack was finally ready to step back, knowing he had done what he could to support her. Emily, too, felt a sense of peace as they pulled into the driveway. She turned to her father, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "Thanks, Dad, for everything. I think I'm ready to move forward now." Jack smiled back, his heart swelling with pride and relief. "I'll always be here, Emily. Whatever you need, whenever you need it." They stepped inside, closing the door on the past, both of them changed but no longer haunted by what had been. As dawn broke over the Arizona horizon, a sense of finality hung in the air. Jack and Emily Carter stood outside their house, their bags packed and loaded into the car, a stark symbol of their choice to leave the desert and all its painful memories behind. The events of the past months had changed them both irrevocably. But now, they were united in a decision to start fresh, to find a place where they could truly heal. The house they were leaving behind, once a sanctuary, had become a reminder of the trauma they were desperate to escape. Emily looked back one last time, her eyes lingering on the walls that had once held her childhood memories. The weight of those memories, now tangled with fear and pain, made her breath hitch, but she swallowed and turned to her father, who watched her with a steady gaze. "Ready, kiddo?" Jack asked softly, his voice carrying a gentleness that Emily had come to rely on. She nodded, managing a small smile. "I am, Dad. For the first time, I really feel like I am." They climbed into the car, pulling away from the house that had once symbolized everything Jack had worked to protect. But his focus had shifted. Emily's ordeal had taught him that safety wasn't just about walls and locks. It was about giving her the freedom to breathe, to reclaim her life on her terms. This journey they were embarking on, miles away from their past, represented that freedom. The road stretched before them like a promise. They drove in companionable silence, the hum of the engine a soothing backdrop to their unspoken reflections. Occasionally, they'd exchange glances, a silent communication of shared strength and resilience. After everything they had been through, words often felt unnecessary, a mere echo of the bond that had grown between them. Eventually, Emily broke the silence, her gaze fixed on the endless road ahead. "I don't know where we're going exactly, but it feels good not to be afraid anymore." She paused, searching for the right words. "I've spent so long looking over my shoulder, thinking about what happened, but I think I'm finally ready to live without that shadow." Jack nodded, his eyes still on the road but his attention fully on her. "Fear is a tough thing to let go of, Em. But I think you've got more strength than even you realize. You took back your life, and I couldn't be prouder." They drove for hours, passing through small towns and wide-open landscapes. The monotony of the road was comforting, each mile putting more distance between them and the darkness of the past. Emily began to relax, the tension in her shoulders easing with every passing signpost and mile marker. She felt a strange excitement bubbling up, a taste of real freedom, unburdened by the memories that had haunted her. They eventually stopped at a small, coastal town with quiet streets lined by eucalyptus trees. The air was cool, filled with the salty tang of the ocean. It was a place untouched by the harshness of the desert, a place where they could both breathe without feeling the weight of their past. Emily walked along the shore that evening, the waves crashing softly at her feet, as Jack followed at a respectful distance, giving her the space he knew she needed. She turned to him, her face alight with something Jack hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Dad, I want to stay here. I think it could be a fresh start for us. He looked around, taking in the serene town and the gentle rhythm of the waves. It's a good place, Emily. Peaceful. If this is where you want to be, then this is where we'll stay. They found a small house to rent near the beach, a modest place with large windows that let in the ocean breeze. There was nothing extravagant about it, but to Jack, it felt like a luxury. Every day, he watched Emily embrace the calm, her laughter returning as she wandered through town, discovering small bookstores and coffee shops, making friends with the locals. Jack, too, found himself softening, his once sharp instincts gradually unwinding in the gentle pace of coastal life. He took long walks along the shore, letting the waves drown out the memories that had haunted him. Emily often joined him, and they'd walk side by side, exchanging stories from her childhood, moments Jack had once thought too trivial to remember but now cherished as treasures. One evening, as they sat by the shore watching the sun sink into the horizon, Emily reached over, resting her hand on his. "Thank you for bringing me here, Dad. I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for you." Jack squeezed her hand, his heart full. "You're the reason I'm here too, Em. You gave me a reason to keep fighting, a reason to be better." They stayed on the beach until the stars came out, sharing memories, dreams, and quiet laughter that filled the empty spaces left by the scars. It was in these simple moments that Jack realized their lives weren't defined by the darkness they'd left behind, but by the new memories they were creating, filled with peace and hope. In the months that followed, Jack found work as a security consultant in the town, a job that allowed him to keep his skills sharp without drawing attention. Emily began volunteering at a local youth center, using her experience to help others find resilience. She became a source of inspiration, her story a reminder to others that it was possible to rebuild, to reclaim one's life. One day, as they walked through the town square, a familiar look of defiance flickered in Emily's eyes, though softened by the calm that had settled within her. "We made it, didn't we?" she asked, a smile playing at her lips. Jack looked at her, pride swelling in his chest. "Yes, we did. And wherever we go from here, we'll face it together." They walked on, leaving only their footprints in the sand, the past finally receding like the waves at their feet. Jack knew they couldn't change what had happened, but they had won their freedom, and that was more powerful than any revenge or battle could ever be.